Welcome back to my channel. How y'all doing? Happy 4th of July. Happy 250th birthday to the United States of America. One of the greatest countries in the world, in my opinion. Yeah, back in 1934, an incident happened in Michigan. Our entire library camp fled the night. So let's go ahead and get into this video here. Alright, let's go and enjoy it. So here we go.
Wexford County, Michigan. 42 men cutting timber in the deepest forest. Then the howling started. Not wolves. Something walking upright. Something that studied them. Something that planned. By Thanksgiving, they knew they weren't alone. By the full moon, they knew they were prey. This is what happened during the 13 days before an entire lumber camp fled into the snow. Subscribe for more true historical horror stories. Leo Watkins swore he heard the scream 7 times before he told anyone. By then, it didn't matter. The thing had already marked us. I arrived at the Wexford County Lumber Camp on November 3rd, 1934. With frozen mud caked to my boots and a contract for winter cutting in my coat pocket. The Great Lakes Timber Company needed 40 men to strip 1,200 acres of white pine before spring thaw, and I needed the $1.50 a day more than I needed to ask questions about why they were hiring so late in the season. The previous crew had walked off the job in October. Management called it a labor dispute. The locals in Manton called it something else. The camp sat in a clearing 8 miles north of the Manistee River, accessible only by a logging road that turned to soup when it rained. 42 men lived in 3 bunkhouses, arranged around a central cookhouse, with the boss's cabin and equipment sheds forming the outer perimeter. Beyond that, nothing but pine forest stretching to the Canadian line. The nearest town was a 4-hour walk through timber so dense you couldn't see the sun at noon. Harold Benson ran the camp with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 30 years turning trees into money. He was 56, barrel-chested, with hands like oak burls and a gray beard that never quite covered the scar running from his left ear to his collar. He met me at the equipment shed while I was drawing my axe and saw. "You worked winter cutting before?" His breath formed clouds in the November air. 5 seasons. Minnesota, Wisconsin. 1 up in the Upper Peninsula. Good. Means you know to keep your mouth shut and your blade sharp. He handed me a wool blanket that smelled of kerosene and old sweat. Bunkhouse 2. Breakfast at 5, in the woods by 6. We cut until we can't see, then we cut some more. Questions? The previous crew walked off, like I said. His eyes held mine for 3 seconds too long. Bunks on the left are taken. Find an empty one on the right. Frank Doyle introduced himself that first night by offering me a cigarette I couldn't afford to refuse. He was 28, lean as a whip, with the kind of permanent grin that made you think he was laughing at a joke he'd never share. He'd been with the camp since August, one of only 7 men who'd stayed after the October exodus. "Don't mind Harold," Frank said, striking a match against the bunkhouse stove. "He's particular about crew stability. Lost 18 men in 3 days last month. Makes a boss nervous." "What spooked them?" Frank's grin widened, but his eyes stayed flat. "Depends who you ask. Some say it was the pay dispute. Company promised bonuses that never materialized. Some say it was the isolation. Camp's farther from civilization than most men like. And some..." He let the cigarette smoke curl toward the rafters. "Some say it was the howling. Wolves? Maybe." He stubbed out the cigarette half-smoked, which told me more than his words. "You bunking near the stove?" "2 rows back." "Good. Stay away from the north wall. It gets cold there. Cold in ways that don't make sense, even for Michigan winter." I didn't ask what he meant. A man learns not to in camps like these, where superstition fills the gaps that whiskey can't reach. The work was what I expected. Brutal, methodical, endless. We felled trees in teams of 2, working in coordination so precise it looked like choreography. The saw sang through white pine, the axe bit into heartwood, and every 4 minutes another giant crashed to the frozen earth with a sound like distant thunder. By the second day, my hands had opened into raw blisters. By the 4th, they'd hardened into calluses that would last until spring. The camp had rhythms that became ritual. Wake at 4:30 to the clang of the cookhouse bell. Dress in darkness, layers of wool and canvas that never quite kept out the cold. Breakfast was fried pork, beans, bread so dense it could stop a bullet, and coffee that tasted like it had been strained through a boot. We ate in silence, conserving energy for the day ahead. In the woods by 6, working in teams spread across a half-mile cutting zone. The forest in early winter was a gray world. Gray sky, gray snow, gray tree bark. The only color came from blood when someone's axe slipped, or from the bright orange surveyor's tape that marked the boundary of our cutting area. Beyond that tape, the old-growth forest remained untouched. Trees so massive it would take 4 men to encircle their trunks. We weren't supposed to cross that boundary. Company orders. Harold made that clear the first day. "The tagged zone is your work area," he announced after breakfast, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Everything west of the surveyor's tape belongs to the state. Anybody caught cutting state timber gets fired, blacklisted, and turned over to the rangers. Understood?" We understood. But it wasn't the rangers that kept us from crossing that boundary. Leo Watkins manned the observation post every night from dusk until 2 a.m., when another man would relieve him until dawn. The post was a 10-foot platform built around a pine tree at the camp's eastern edge, equipped with a spotlight, a rifle, and a logbook for recording anything unusual. Its official purpose was fire watch. Its real purpose was keeping inventory of the equipment sheds and making sure nobody got drunk enough to wander into the woods and freeze to death. Leo was 43, methodical, and sober by necessity, if not by preference. He'd been a merchant marine before the Depression and seen things on night watches that made him comfortable with darkness and solitude. He rarely spoke during meals, but when he did, men listened. On my 9th night in camp, November 11th, Leo came to breakfast with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "Heard something last night," he said to no one in particular, spooning beans onto his plate with mechanical precision. "Out past the boundary tape, 3 a.m., maybe 4. Couldn't tell the direction exactly. Sound does strange things in timber that dense." "What kind of something?" Frank asked. Leo's spoon stopped moving. "Howling, but not wolves. Wrong pitch, wrong rhythm. Wolves hunt in packs, call and response. This was..." He set down the spoon. "This was one animal making sounds like it was having a conversation with itself." The table went quiet. 15 men stopped eating and pretended they weren't listening while hanging on every word. "How long?" Harold asked from the head of the table. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Started deep in the old growth, west side. Moved north along the boundary, then went silent. Leo looked at his plate, like he'd forgotten what food was for. I swept the spotlight across the tree line 6 times. Didn't see anything. But something was there. Something big enough that I could hear branches breaking when it moved. Bear, someone suggested. Bears don't howl, Frank said quietly. Maybe a catamount, another voice offered. Big cat. Sounds almost human sometimes. Leo shook his head. I know what a cougar sounds like. This wasn't that. Harold stood, which meant the conversation was over. Probably just a wolf with something wrong with it. Diseased, maybe rabid. We'll set extra traps along the western perimeter. Leo, log it in the incident book. Everyone else, you got trees to cut. But nobody moved quite fast enough. The cookhouse held that particular silence that comes when men have heard something they recognize but can't name. The traps caught nothing. For 3 days we worked under skies the color of old iron, felling pine and hauling logs to the skid road where they'd wait for the spring melt and the river drive to Manton. The forest gave up its timber reluctantly, each tree groaning and cracking as if protesting its own death. On the 4th night after Leo's report, I was awakened by Frank's hand on my shoulder. The bunkhouse was dark except for the dim glow of the banked stove. You awake? He whispered. Am now. Come outside. Quiet. I followed him out into air so cold it burned my lungs. The moon was 3 days from full, bright enough to cast shadows across the clearing. Frank led me to the edge of the equipment yard, where the lumber camp ended and the forest began. Look at the tree line, he said. Western edge, about 40 yards from the big poplar. I looked. At first, I saw nothing but the usual tangle of winter forest. Bare branches, snow-dusted undergrowth, darkness between the trees. Then something moved. Not moved, exactly. Shifted. A shadow that was slightly wrong. Too tall and too still to be natural. How long has it been there? I whispered. 10 minutes. Maybe longer. I came out to piss and saw it. Hasn't moved since. We watched in silence. The shadow remained motionless. But somehow I knew it was watching us back. The certainty of being observed crawled up my spine like ice water. Then it was gone. Not retreating, not fading. Simply gone, as if it had never existed. Did you see? Frank started. Yeah. What do we tell Harold? I thought about that for longer than I should have. Nothing, not yet. We don't know what we saw. But that was a lie. We knew exactly what we'd seen. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that was watching the camp with an intelligence that had nothing to do with animal instinct. Frank lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The men who left last month, he said. They saw it too. Before they left, they wouldn't talk about it directly, but you could tell. They'd seen something that changed how they looked at the forest. Why'd you stay? He took a long drag, the ember bright in the darkness. Because I need the money. Because jobs like this don't come around twice. And because part of me needs to know what the hell is out there. He looked at me with that grin that wasn't quite a grin. You think that makes me stupid or brave? Both, I said. He laughed, but the sound had no humor in it. Yeah, that's what I figured. We went back inside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Sometime around 4 a.m., I heard it. A howl that started low and rose to something that sounded almost like human speech, almost like laughter, almost like a question being asked of the darkness. Leo heard it too. So did everyone else in camp. But when morning came, no one mentioned it. We just ate our breakfast in silence, gathered our tools, and walked into the woods like men marching towards something we couldn't name, but knew was waiting. The cutting continued. The forest kept its secrets. And somewhere beyond the boundary table, something watched us work. first animal died on November 19th. We found it at dawn, 20 yards from the mess hall, positioned where every man walking to breakfast would have to see it. It had been a deer once. A young buck, maybe 2 years old, with antlers still in velvet. What remained looked like it had been taken apart by something that understood anatomy. The rib cage was splayed open with surgical precision, organs removed and arranged in a pattern that Harold made us destroy before the rest of the crew saw it. The hide had been peeled back in strips, muscle tissue exposed to the freezing air. But here's what made my hands shake when I helped Harold drag it into the woods. There were no bite marks, no claw mark. The tissue had been torn by something with fingers. "Don't tell the men about the pattern," Harold said, his voice low as we buried what was left under dead-fallen snow. "Tell them it was wolves. A pack, frenzied, probably diseased. Tell them anything but what we actually saw." "What did we see?" He looked at me with eyes that had gone flat and old. "Something that wanted us to know it was here. Something that wanted us to understand it could reach into the center of camp whenever it pleased." Frank found the tracks that afternoon. He'd been hauling logs on the skid road when he noticed impressions in the mud near the western boundary. He didn't call attention to them, just caught my eye and jerked his head toward the tree line during the lunch break. The prints were wrong in every measurable way. They started as four-legged impressions, large, canine, with claw marks extending 2 inches beyond the pad. Then, 30 feet later, they transitioned to two-legged tracks. The rear paws had elongated, developed something like heels, and the stride had widened to nearly 4 feet between steps. Whatever made them had stood up and kept walking. "I've been logging for 8 years, Frank said, crouching beside the prints. "I've seen bear tracks, wolf tracks, even found moose sign once up near Mackinac. Never seen anything like this. Never even heard of anything like this." I knelt beside him, studying the transition point where 4 legs became 2. The prints were fresh, probably from the previous night. In one of them, I could see individual claw marks so deep they'd scored the frozen earth beneath the mud. "We need to tell Harold," I said. "Harold already knows. Why do you think he posted Leo at the observation platform every night? Why do you think the previous crew walked off?" Frank stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "This isn't the first time something's happened here. This camp has been operating in Wexford County since 1928. 6 years, 5 different crews. The average stay is 3 months. Men keep leaving, company keeps hiring, and nobody talks about why." "How do you know this?" "Because I went to the county records office in Manton last month when I had a weekend pass. Looked up the company logs, the employment records, the incident reports filed with the state forestry department. Every autumn, same pattern. Crew turnover spikes, equipment goes missing, and there's always at least one mention of animal attacks that don't match any known species in the region. A branch snapped somewhere in the old growth forest." We both turned toward the sound, instinctively reaching for axes that weren't there. Nothing moved in the tree line, but the silence that followed felt deliberate, like something had stopped breathing to listen to us listening to it. "We should get back to work," Frank said. But neither of us moved for another 30 seconds. Leo started keeping unofficial records on November 21st. He showed them to me and Frank after dinner, spreading pages torn from his personal notebook across his bunk, while the other men played cards or repaired equipment at the far end of the bunkhouse. 7 sightings in 12 days, he said, his finger tracing entries written in precise, tiny script. November 11th, auditory contact, 3 to 4 a.m., western boundary. November 14th, visual contact, 2300 hours, eastern perimeter, approximately 40 yards distance. Subject remained stationary for 11 minutes. November 16th, auditory contact. Multiple vocalizations, 0200 hours, circling pattern around camp. Duration, 43 minutes. The list continued. Each entry included time, location, type of contact, duration, and weather conditions. Leo had been documenting everything with the methodical precision of a man trained to keep watch logs on merchant vessels. Has it approached the buildings? I asked. Not yet. It maintains a perimeter between 30 and 50 yards from the structures. But the radius is tightening. On November 11th, closest approach was 52 yards. Last night, it was 33. He looked up from the notebook. It's learning the camp layout, testing our response patterns. Every night, it gets a little bolder. Frank lit a cigarette, his third in an hour. What's it waiting for? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just curious. Leo's voice carried no conviction. Or maybe it's waiting for the full moon. That's in 6 days, I said. I know. The three of us sat in silence while the stove ticked and settled. Somewhere outside, a night bird called once and went quiet. We could leave, Frank said finally. Just pack our gear and walk out. 4 hours to Met. Catch the morning train to Detroit or Chicago or anywhere that isn't here. And tell them what? Leo asked. That we abandoned a high-paying job because we were scared of sounds in the woods. Who's going to hire men who run from shadows? Better than dying in these woods, Frank said. Maybe. But I've got a wife and 2 daughters in Grand Rapids. They're counting on my wages. I walk off this job without finishing the season. I don't eat. They don't eat. Leo folded his notebook with careful precision. So I stay. I watch. I document. And when something finally happens that's undeniable, we'll have proof that we weren't just spooked city boys who couldn't handle wilderness living. The second kill happened November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving. This time it was one of the draft horses, a massive Belgian named Duke, who'd been pulling logs since August. We found him in his paddock behind the equipment shed, killed sometime between midnight and dawn. The paddock fence was intact. The gate was still latched from the outside. Duke was inside, dead, with his throat opened so precisely it looked like surgical incision rather than animal attack. The ground around him was churned into mud, hoof prints showing he'd panicked and tried to run, but something had held him in place long enough to complete the kill. Harold stood looking at the body for 5 full minutes without speaking. The rest of us waited, tools in hand, breath-forming clouds in the November cold. Finally, he turned to face the assembled crew. I'm asking for volunteers, he said. Tonight, armed watch and shifts. 2 men every 3 hours, positioned at the observation post and the equipment shed. Rifles, spotlights, whistles to signal if anything approaches. We identify what's killing our stock and we deal with it. Who's willing? Every hand went up. Even the men who'd been whispering about leaving, even the ones who avoided looking at the woods after dark. Fear makes men do strange things, but so does pride. No lumberjack wants to admit he's frightened of something he can't name. We drew lots. Frank and I pulled the midnight to 3 shift. Leo took 3 to 6 with a man named Paulson who'd been with the camp since September. The day felt longer than it should have. We worked through standard cutting rotations, but every man's attention was split between the saw and the tree line. Twice, work stopped completely when someone thought they saw movement in the old growth. Both times, it was nothing. Or nothing we could prove. Dinner was venison stew and potatoes, but nobody had much appetite. Harold announced that the Thanksgiving meal would proceed as planned the next day. Roasted turkey, all the fixings, double portions for any man who wanted them. It was a gesture toward normalcy that fooled no one. At 11:50 p.m., Frank and I took our positions. He climbed to the observation post with a Winchester and a spotlight. I stationed myself at the equipment shed with a shotgun and a kerosene lantern that threw more shadow than light. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. The moon, 5 days from full, turned the camp clearing silver white. Frost formed on my beard within minutes. I stamped my feet and tucked my hands under my arms, the shotgun balanced across my knees. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. The forest remained silent in a way that felt wrong. No wind in the branches, no small animals rustling through undergrowth. Even the usual settling sounds of the camp. Wood contracting in the cold, snow sliding from roofs, seemed muffled, as if the world had wrapped itself in cotton. At 1:40 a.m., Frank's spotlight swept across the western tree line. Once, twice, then focused on a single point and held steady. I stood, raising the shotgun, squinting against the glare. At first, I saw nothing. Then the spotlight adjusted, angling down, and I saw the eyes. They were yellow-green, reflecting the light with the characteristic shine of Tapetum lucidum, the mirror-like layer behind predator retinas that enhances night vision. But they were positioned 7 feet off the ground, and they weren't moving. The thing was standing upright, just beyond the boundary tape, watching us with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Frank's spotlight held steady. Neither of us moved. For 30 seconds, maybe 40, we existed in a frozen triangle. 2 men with weapons, 1 creature without. Separated by 60 yards of clear distance meant nothing if it doesn't.
These kind of instances all the time happens throughout the Midwest, up north, down in the south. There are things like this that goes unknown by people in the world. Because 1, they don't want to recognize it. 2, the government keeps it hidden. Or 3, they're afraid people will call them crazy. Since this happened in the United States in 1939, there have been more accidents, more sightings and incidents of this kind of stuff happening from 1930 to 1960. If you ever think of every 13 years, sightings like this happens. My grandpa always say when stuff like this happens, the world of the living, the world of the dead is merging. Meaning the spiritual world and the physical world are coming together slowly, 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 until you don't know what's alive or dead. He always told me another thing too. Don't go in the woods that have a lot of death happening or whistling. And my dad said sometimes at nighttime you don't need to whistle in the woods because somebody whistle back to you that shouldn't be there. Well, let's get back to the video. That's just my input, so yeah.
Decided to close the gap, told them. Then it vocalized. Not a howl, not a growl. Something between speech and animal communication. A sound that rose and fell with inflections that almost suggested language. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. When it stopped, the thing turned and walked back into the forest. Not fleeing, not hurrying. Just turning with deliberate casualness and disappearing into darkness, as if it had finished making whatever point it came to make. Frank's spotlight swept the tree line for another 10 minutes. We saw nothing else. At 3 a.m., Leo and Paulson relieved us. Frank told them what we'd seen, his voice steady but his hands still shaking slightly when he handed over the Winchester. "How tall?" Leo asked, already writing in his notebook. 7 feet, maybe more. The eyes were level with the lower branches on the pine at the boundary marker. Build? Couldn't see details. Just the eyes in a silhouette, broad shoulders, long arms. Moved on two legs when it walked away. Leo finished writing and looked up at us. That makes 9 confirmed visual contacts in 13 days. The pattern is accelerating. We left them there and walked back to the bunkhouse. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd seen it. We'd been seen by it. And tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and the full moon was 4 days away. And something in the Wexford County forest had decided we were worth its attention. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We just lay in our bunks, listening to the forest silence, and waited for morning. Thanksgiving dinner was served at 4 p.m. on November 24th, 1934, and it was the last normal thing we ever did together. Harold had ordered 2 turkeys from Manton the previous week, hauled into camp by supply wagon, along with canned cranberries, flour for biscuits, and a case of beer that appeared without explanation or comment. The cookhouse filled with steam and the smell of roasting meat. And for 3 hours that afternoon, we pretended we were somewhere else, somewhere safe. 42 men ate in shifts, the bunkhouses emptying and refilling as crews rotated through the meal. Frank proposed a toast to surviving the season. Leo raised his beer and said nothing, his eyes on the windows and the darkness gathering beyond them. The man next to me, a faller named Morrison, who'd been in camp since September, told a joke about a priest and a lumber baron that got genuine laughs. By 7 p.m., most men had retreated to their bunks, full and tired and grateful for a day without cutting. The card games started up again. Someone produced a harmonica and played songs I half remembered from childhood. Harold made his rounds, checking that the stoves were properly banked and the lamps trimmed for night watch. At 8:15, the howling started. This time, it didn't come from the boundary. It came from 3 directions simultaneously, west, north, and east. As if the forest itself had found a voice and was using it to surround us. The sound rose and fell in patterns that suggested coordination, call, and response. 3 distinct voices working in harmony that had nothing to do with wolves or any animal I'd ever heard. The harmonica stopped. The card games froze. 42 men sat in absolute silence while something outside demonstrated it knew exactly where we were and wanted us to know it was closing in. The howling continued for 7 minutes by Leo's count. Then it stopped with the abruptness of a door slamming, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. Harold appeared in the bunkhouse doorway, fully dressed, rifle in hand. Armed watch now. Every man who volunteered, grab your weapon and report to the cookhouse. Everyone else, stay in the bunkhouses, keep the stoves hot, and stay away from the windows. Nobody goes outside alone, nobody. We organized into teams of 4, each taking a cardinal point around the camp perimeter. Frank, Leo, Morrison, and I drew the western position, the direction where the tracks had first appeared. We positioned ourselves behind a stack of cut timber that provided cover and a clear sight line to the tree line. The moon rose at 9:30, 4 days from full but bright enough to cast hard shadows across the clearing. The forest was a black wall punctuated by individual trees that stood like sentinels at the boundary of our world. Somewhere beyond them, something was moving. We heard it first. Branches breaking with the snap of rifle shots. Heavy footfalls in undergrowth, circling the camp in a clockwise pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. It was staying just inside the old growth, using the dense timber as cover. but making no effort to move quietly. It wanted us to know it was there. "Contact," Leo whispered, his rifle tracking movement we couldn't quite see. "Northeast quadrant, moving east to south. Speed approximately 3 miles per hour. Range 100 yards and closing." I raised my shotgun, thumbing back both hammers. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the frozen air. The footfall stopped. Complete silence for 15 seconds. Then a vocalization from directly west of our position, maybe 60 yards out. Not the howl we'd heard earlier. This was different. Lower, almost conversational. A sound that rose and fell with cadences that suggested questions being asked and answered. "It's behind us now," Frank said, his voice tight. "How did it get behind us?" "There's more than one," Morrison said. He was the oldest among us, 53 with 30 years of logging experience and hands that didn't shake even now. Has to be. Nothing moves that fast through timber that dense. Another vocalization, this time from the south, then the east, then the north. 4 distinct voices, all surrounding the camp, all maintaining perfect distance from our position. "They're coordinating," Leo said. He'd lowered his rifle, understanding what we all understood. You can't shoot what you can't see, and even if you could, there were too many of them, and only one of you. The vocalizations continued for 20 minutes, a conversation conducted in a language that predated human speech. Then, as abruptly as they'd started, they stopped. What followed was worse than sound. It was the awareness of being watched by multiple intelligences, all focused on our small circle of light and warmth, with an attention that felt almost hungry. Not for food, for something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. At 11:40 p.m., Harold called us back to the cookhouse for rotation and warming. We stumbled inside, stamping feeling back into frozen feet, hands cramped around weapons we'd held ready for 3 hours. "Anyone see anything?" Harold asked. 14 men shook their heads. We'd all heard. We'd all felt watched. But none of us had seen. "Next rotation at midnight," Harold said. "Eat something, get warm, and get back out there. Whatever's in those woods, it's not getting into this camp." The attack came at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because Leo was compulsive about his watch log, and he was writing the timestamp when the door to Equipment Shed 3 exploded outward in a shower of splinters and frozen hinges. The thing came through at full speed, low and fast, a blur of fur and muscle that crossed the 30 feet to the nearest bunkhouse in under 3 seconds. It hit the wall with enough force to shake the entire structure, claws scoring deep furrows in the timber siding as it scrambled for purchase on the roof. Someone fired. The muzzle flash lit the clearing in a strobe of white light that burned after images into my vision. I saw it then, just for an instant. 7 feet tall, even on all fours, shoulders bunched with muscle, head that was wrong in every proportion. Too long, too narrow, mouth open to show teeth that belonged in nightmare. It disappeared over the roofline. Men were shouting, pouring out of the bunkhouses in various states of dress and panic. Harold was bellowing orders that nobody heard. Another shot, then 3 more in rapid succession, the reports echoing off the forest and coming back distorted. Something crashed in the equipment yard. Metal screamed against metal. The thing had gone through the tool shed like it was made of paper, scattering saws and axes and peavies across the frozen ground. Frank appeared beside me, rifle raised. "Did you see it?" "Yeah." "What the hell was it?" Before I could answer, the howling started again. But this time it wasn't surrounding us. It was above us, On the roof of Bunkhouse 2, directly overhead, something was vocalizing with a volume and intensity that shook snow from the rafters. Men scattered. The ones with guns fired blind into the darkness. The ones without weapons just ran, breaking Harold's orders, heading for any structure that wasn't being torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. I saw Morrison go down, slipping on ice, his rifle sliding away across frozen mud. The thing on the roof turned toward the movement, with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. For one frozen second, I saw its eyes reflect lamplight. Yellow-green, intelligent, focused. Then Frank fired. The bullet took it high in the shoulder, spinning it sideways. It howled, a sound that started animal and ended almost human, and launched itself off the roof into darkness. We converged on Morrison, hauling him to his feet, dragging him toward the cookhouse. Behind us, something massive hit the ground and kept running, crashing through the equipment yard and disappearing into the western tree line. We barricaded ourselves in the cookhouse for the rest of the night. 42 men, armed with everything from rifles to kitchen knives, standing watch in shifts while others tried to sleep on tables and floor. The stoves were stoked to maximum, less for warmth than for the psychological comfort of light and heat. Harold organized damage assessment at first light. Equipment Shed 3 was destroyed, the door torn completely off and half the wall collapsed. The tool shed had a hole punched through the north side, large enough to drive a wagon through. Bunkhouse 2's roof showed claw marks 4 inches deep in solid timber, and there was blood. Not ours. We'd counted heads twice. All 42 men accounted for. No injuries beyond bruises and Morrison's twisted ankle. But there was blood in the equipment yard, a trail of it leading west into the forest. Dark red, almost black in the morning light. Frank's bullet had found its mark. "We're leaving," Harold announced at breakfast. His voice carried no room for argument. "I'm paying every man through the end of December full wages, as if you'd finished the season. But we're packing today and hiking out tomorrow at first light. Anyone who wants to stay is welcome to run this camp themselves." Nobody wanted to stay. We spent November 26th preparing to abandon the camp. Tools were inventoried and secured. Personal items were packed. The draft horses, the 3 that remained after Duke's death, were harnessed to wagons loaded with essential equipment. Everything else would be left for the company to recover in spring, if they dared. That night, the last night, the howling returned. But it was different now. Farther away, moving north through the forest, fading with distance. It sounded almost like disappointment, like something had tested us and found us wanting, or perhaps had made its point and was moving on to other territories, other encounters. Leo made his final log entry at 3 a.m. Subject departed approximately 0230 hours. Direction north-northwest. Sustained speed approximately 8 miles per hour based on auditory tracking. Camp will be evacuated at dawn. Incident report to be filed with Great Lakes Timber Company and Michigan State Forestry Department. Recommend permanent closure of this location. We walked out on November 27th, a column of 42 men stretching a quarter mile along the logging road. The forest watched us go in silence. No birds, no wind, just the sound of boots on frozen mud and the creak of wagon wheels and men breathing in clouds of steam. 4 hours later, we reached Manton. Harold paid us in cash from the company account, shaking each man's hand, saying nothing. We scattered from there, some to Detroit, some to Chicago, a few back to families in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Frank took the train to Cleveland, promising to write, but never doing so. Leo returned to Grand Rapids and went back to the Merchant Marine, finding comfort in different darknesses. I took my wages and drifted west, working camps in Oregon and Washington, always preferring the coastal forests where the timber was hemlock and Douglas fir and the darkness held different terrors. I never went back to Michigan. The Great Lakes Timber Company closed the Wexford County operation permanently in spring of 1935. The official record states operational difficulties and insufficient profit margins. The camp buildings were left to rot, the equipment salvaged by crews who worked only in daylight and never stayed past dusk. Sometimes I still hear it in my dreams. That rising howl that was almost speech, almost laughter, almost a question asking whether we understood that the forests have always been someone else's territory, and we were only ever visitors being temporarily tolerated. I'm 73 now, writing this in a boarding house in Aberdeen, Washington, where the rain never stops and the timber industry is dying, and young men don't believe stories from old men about the things that lived in the woods before we came. That's fine. Belief isn't required. But I'll tell you what I told my son before he took that logging job in Montana. Some forests don't want to be cut. Some territories were claimed long before humans drew their first maps. And some things that walk upright under the full moon have been doing so since before our ancestors learned to fear the dark. The Michigan Dogman, they call it now. There are stories going back to the 1800s, legends from Ottawa and Ojibwa traditions that predate European settlement by centuries. Every 7 years, they say, it returns. 1934 was a return year. So was 1941 and 1948, and every 7 years since. I don't know if that's true. I only know what I saw in Wexford County during the winter of 1934. Something that walked on 2 legs and 4. Something that thought and planned and coordinated. Something that knew we didn't belong and made sure we understood our place. We left. It stayed. That's how these things end. The